So let's talk more about emotional intelligence, and particularly about emotional intelligence in leadership. And what does that look like? And what's the impact that that has on the leader's team and organization? So recently, Gallup did a poll on employee engagement in which they had clearly identified that the cost ranges from $450 billion to $550 billion in lost revenue. Now, I don't know. To me, that's pretty staggering. I was working with one organization though when I went in to talk to them about their employees and their employee turnover, and they actually claimed that was just a cost of doing business. But I don't think most people feel that way. I think it's staggering. Now, there's been a lot of work out there. There's a lot of companies that have built great training to help engage employees, and I'm not saying that employees don't have a part of ownership in that, but what I've chosen to do is take a different approach. And the approach that I would like to submit to you is that the reason why I think there's a big part of employees are not engaged is because the leaders are not engaged with the employees. To kind of put some data behind this conversation we're going to have today, I want to introduce you to a good friend of mine. His name is David Hatch. And David Hatch did a lot of research, written several books, and most importantly, wrote a book with a person called Stephen Covey, in which he went out and researched all the greatest leaders that have been identified in history and what made them successful, what made the leaders that weren't successful. And he just, for almost 10 years, he did this research and gathered all this data. And from that research, he compiled it all into what he referred to as leading indicators, those key elements that brought about great leaders. I'd like to share with you his research today, and particularly so that help us to understand, so why is this idea of emotional intelligence so important? I mean, it's been around for a long time. 1994 is when it really emerged on the market. And for probably the first 10 years that emotional intelligence was out there, it was this buzzword. Everybody was talking about it. Companies were springing up everywhere talking about emotional intelligence and providing training. And then it kind of just fell off. And now recently, probably because of the need, it is now emerging again as a critical competency for leaders. That if you aren't emotionally intelligent, if you don't have that skill set as a leader, then you're failing, because it's a required, and you'll see through the data here, it's not just important, it was actually identified by people in all of these companies as the most important. So you can see on the slide that there's this way that leaders have been assessed over time. And probably the most common is what you see as the outside circle, where a leader was assessed based off of their culture, based off of the issues, based off of results going on in an organization. But then there's another way that wasn't assessed as well, and that is this idea of assessing the leader and what was the leader about as an individual. In fact, and in particularly, what was their level of character and their level of competence, and how did they assess that? So David's research then, as he compiled all that, and he came up with these leading indicators, he found that these leading indicators led us to the best way to assess a leader is on the inside approach to leadership. In essence, that character and competence, and really find out where the leader stood in terms of those two areas. So now as we look at these leading indicators, there's three key buckets of the data that he drew from. First was he reviewed the literature that was out there, articles that had been written about leadership. He pulled from all of those of what great leaders were. Second, he looked at the competency models and the different companies that had designed great competency models that were turning out good leaders. And so he tapped into those and found out what was made up. And then the third and probably most important was the data. He went out and sent information out to all these companies across the country and across the world, and asking the questions, what makes great leaders? What are the behaviors of great leaders? And there's 33,000 data points. When we talk about a data point, it's literally a statement that says, when somebody wrote back in, and it wasn't just checking a box, they had to write in, a great leader does this. 33,000 of those. Well, then he categorized all of those, and he came up with 52 of these competencies. One of the first initial findings he found was these 33,000 statements. And here's an example of what some of those statements look like. For example, people wrote in that a leader motivates people to higher levels. A leader executes strategies and gets results. and so on and so forth. So these are 33,000 of these. And he took those, lumped them into these different clusters, these different categories, and they lumped them into these buckets. As you can see here, there's a bucket on communication. There's a bucket on creating vision, on problem solving. So these are different buckets by which they created all of this data went into. So why is that important? So now we know, now we have all of these competencies. It says, well, a great leader needs to know how to communicate. A great leader needs to know how to create vision. Why is that important? It wasn't that just they said a great leader was a good communicator, but then they actually started to identify what communication looked like. So as you can see on the slide, a great communicator is somebody that presents ideas clearly, keeps people informed, listens for understanding. So now we start getting down to the actual behaviors. So it's one thing just to identify competency. It's another thing to clearly articulate the behaviors that match those competencies. So now we have this data that says, this is what people want from their leaders. These are the competencies, and these are the behaviors. We found that data could be stratified into two groups. There was a top 20 and then a bottom 32. So in other words, of the 52, 75% of the competencies that were identified to be most important were in the top 20. The others were important, but not as important. So now let's take those top 20 and see what came out of that. One of the findings that they came now up to was that as they looked at all the data and they put it into they stratified it, they came up with this idea that character matters. And in fact, character mattered more than the competency of the leader. This ability that the leader had to be human, right? This idea of character, who they are, knowing who they are, and them knowing who I am. So, and the different competencies that were identified were critical to know this. And this is the first time anybody had challenged the current status that says, as a great leader, you need to be smart. This research says that people don't want just a leader that's smart. In fact, more importantly, we want a leader that has character. Now, what does character look like? What are some of the competencies associated to character? Let me share what those are, and you'll start to see how many of them actually are emotional intelligence behaviors and characters. So as you can see on the slide, it's broken into character and competence. And as you start reading down the character list, you're going to start seeing things like a leader's honest, a leader's respectful, a leader's open to input, a leader's fair, and many of those others that you see on that list. So why is that important? Everything we've talked about today is, well, how is emotional intelligence important for leadership? This data shows us what they want from their leaders is a leader that is emotionally intelligent and also smart. Of the competencies that were identified, 57% of the competencies that were identified that made great leaders, 57% of that had to do with character, which is the real foundation to this idea that we're talking about called emotional intelligence. So if you want to become greater at leadership, you want to become better at getting the results, then learn how to engage with humans through developing your emotional intelligence. And as you do, you'll be surprised of how fast your trust goes, the confidence goes, and the results that you're trying to get as a leader improve. This is not a slow process. It's actually a very fast process if you put the deliberate work and effort into becoming a leader of character, not just a leader of intelligence. So to bring this to conclusion, it's not that one is actually more important than the other. As you can see in the model in front of you, it's competence times character equals the success that we're trying to get to. So character is actually an accelerator, right? Imagine, think of somebody in your life, again, that you really, really have a great relationship with. How long does it take to get communication done? How long does it take to get things done and things accomplished? Probably pretty fast, pretty quick. And so that's what we're trying to do as a leader. How long does it take you to get things done as a leader? If you're trying to do it all on your own because you don't think that anybody else is smart enough, or can you have the trust and confidence in the others because your character allows you to go and build that you can get the things done that you want to get done? So that's the challenge. If you've been a leader that has ridden off of being smart, now you know you got some work to do. Beginning this journey, in the middle of this journey, towards the end of your journey, wherever you're at, you can always improve and become better in your professional life. So click below on the PDF. We'll give you some tools, some tips on how to be more effective in your leadership role and continue to help us as we go on our journey to put the human back into humanity.